Nancy, thank you so much for having us in your studio. Where exactly are you right now?
I'm in my studio here in Topanga, and it's beautiful and warm here, and that's where I am.
Oh, amazing. And for how long have you been there?
I have lived here since the spring of '83.
That's incredible. That's
Yeah.
incredible. And when the lockdown happened, did you just stay where you are? Did you just stay
Yep.
locked?
Yep. Yep. I have a wonderful vegetable garden. I got a freezer. Friends sometimes come and bring me vegetables, and I have a studio, and I just work here. So it's been fun. I'm fortunate. It's very beautiful here. If you have to be locked down, this is a nice place to do it.
And how are you dealing with the crisis? Are you trying to record and memorialize or visualize this time, or you're trying to use this time to reflect and just pause? Or how are you?
No,
What's your position?
I'm a workaholic, Klaus. And prior to Corona, I was ready. I had my crew ready. I had the materials ready. We were getting ready to make a new body of work, which we'd probably be in about the 5th week of it right now. And as soon as Corona happened, I knew I had to make a quick left turn. And I have this lovely crew in the studio and in the office. And so we got the office people into their homes and taking their computers. The studio crew, thank goodness, I've been able to redirect them to do work at home. One person comes into the studio, and when the other people do, they come one at a time. So folks are doing work at home, bringing the parts of the work that they're doing back to the studio, and another person is weaving that whole group of work together. Me personally, instead of going into that new body of sculpture, I'm gone down to the hill to an old studio I had that was completely empty, and I'm making drawings, and I have thousands of pencils and hundreds of feet of gorgeous paper, so I could draw for a long time and be perfectly happy, to tell you the truth.
Do you think these unprecedented times will somehow be reflected in art being made this year?
Oh, absolutely. How can you avoid it? You know, this is so huge. Nobody can really figure out how it is changing us, but it is such a huge change in who we are as a people and how we relate and what we're going to do in the future. This seems like such a huge change, Klaus, that of course it's going to be reflected in the work. How, I'm clueless as to how, you know, but it's going to be in there. Everybody's work, everybody who makes things and creates things and invents things and thinks about how to run some businesses. It's changing a lot.
Mm-hmm. One of your first institutional solo shows was 1995 at the Museum of Modern Art. And Roberta, she wrote that the materials you use have a tendency, just as the materials, to kind of signal either the violence and the delicacy of the material. So thinking about the violence of the situation and the delicacy, how all we feel right now, I think your sculpture is always, and your drawings are always such accumulations of force and balance. And so I especially think this quote from Roberta Smith, how she was describing your work, I thought about it a lot, thinking about our conversation here during the crisis. Is drawing a way that you keep an equilibrium and then later formulate, or is there any other record keeping you do right now as a sculptor, as an artist?
No, I really, other than documenting stuff with pictures, that's not anything I've really done. But I've always appreciated embracing contradictions. Something that appears very dense is actually something that's very delicate. Something that's very delicate is actually very dense. Something, you know, I really have an appreciation for embracing those contradictions and bringing this odd holes that you don't know really which way it's going, nor do I.
Yeah.
Really.
When we prepared this, I asked you if we could talk about the work from early on, because everybody knows your work of the last, let's say 20, 30 years, but you have been working since the 70s. And so perhaps we go to the slideshow.
Okay.
And we look at pieces together, because that's always what I appreciate most of these visits, that we can see actually art together, and we can see art together with the artist, and we can talk about it. Great.
Okay, so this is undergraduate work. This is like 1972. I was probably 18 or 19 years old. Just go back a second to the first slide, please. And this is bathtubs and bananas. And at that time, I really loved clay and ceramics. The clay department, the ceramics department was where I really loved making things. But the craftsmanship, all of the glazing and the firing of the stuff and the craftsmanship that went along with ceramics was not at all interesting to me. I really loved the clay. So what I figured out to do is I could simply make these works very quickly out of the raw clay and put any kind of colorant on them I wanted. And then I could put them back into the slip bucket. So I could work very quickly. For instance, I could make 12 to 16 of these pieces in maybe a week and a half. And I could work through the piece and through the idea very quickly. For me, rather than the sculptures being an end to something, they were a tool that I was interested in using to get me from one place to another, to help me figure out a certain notion, a certain idea, and help me get to the next idea. At the time I was doing these things, looking at art magazines was really important. So I was obviously conscious of people like Yayoi Kusama, Ava Hess, Linda Benglis, Agnes Martin, you know, organic material that was repetitive, organic forms that was repetitive. So I am a student. I'm taking all these pictures at the train station, little 25-cent pictures. Go back a second. And my art school brings in all these wonderful artists from Northern California. Bill Wiley, Wayne Thiebaud, Bob Arneson, Roy DeForest. And I was really enamored by what these guys were doing, this Northern Bay Area funk pop thing. And Thiebaud was painting cakes, and Oldenburg in New York was making the store days and with the plaster. And Arneson was making these marvelous self-portraits. And I thought, I can make a self-portrait too. So this is self-portrait as a birthday cake. Again, it was made out of the clay. What's that?
This is early 70s when you were in San Francisco?
Yeah, no, it's art in San Francisco, Maryland Institute College of Art, MICA in Baltimore.
Ah, amazing.
So you can go to the next slide, please. So this, again, in that same series, you know, the idea of a cake. And as a kid, I made little jelly bean roses that I rolled up the slices and put them and made roses for the cakes. This is wet clay, and I made the roses, and then I could take pictures and throw it into the dumpster, back into the slip bucket. You can go to the next slide, please. What, Klaus? What, Klaus?
Wet clay sculptures, you never burnt the clay. The clay sculptures
never.
were there until the clay got dry and they fell apart, right?
Yeah, right. Okay, so this is kind of a phallic time, and these are cactus plants. And right after I did these, a guy came to my teacher who had a television talk show, Larry Angel in Baltimore, and said, you know, it's National Craftsman's Week, and we would like a couple of your students to give a glaze demonstration. So me and my friend Maria Papadimitriou, she had never glazed anything in her life before either, decided that we can do this. And it was a great opportunity to go on TV and have an idea and develop something for TV. So we thought a couple days, and we didn't have any good ideas. And we kept coming up with ideas and rejecting them. Then the night before, which is like 11 o'clock at night, we're supposed to be there at 7 in the morning, we think, you know, let's go watch Johnny Carson. We're gonna watch Johnny Carson and see what he does, and maybe he can give us an idea of how we can go about this. So we listened to Johnny Carson, and Johnny Carson, we realized that he could say anything he wanted. Johnny Carson could say anything he wanted, but it was the way he said it. It was the style, it was his manner of speaking that really allowed him to say anything. Okay, good. So we turned off the TV, we go back into Maria's kitchen, and there on her kitchen table is a beautiful phallic cactus, a green cactus in a plastic pot with dirt, just like the cactuses that I have been making, sort of, kind of. And that's what we were going to do. We were going to tell that audience that that cactus was indeed ceramic. And we've been working on this glaze formula to do this super realist kind of ceramics for 3 years now. And last week, the Russians gave us a secret formula, and we got this lump of clay on TV, and we brought the real cactus, and we made this kind of phallic thing, and we poured flour and food coloring and water over it and told them that was a secret formula. And you could do this in your kitchen and bring it to cone 10 and back down to 8. And like any good surrealist sculpture, your sculpture would come out looking exactly like the real cactus. So you can go to the next slide, please. So that was, next slide, please.
Next. We have a problem with...
Okay, so these were the paintings at the time. I was really thinking a lot about the, first of all, I took painting because Sal Scarpita was teaching painting. I wasn't interested in painting, but I wanted to work with Sal Scarpita, who was truly a brilliant artist, a wonderful artist. And Sal had 1 foot in Italy and 1 foot in New York, and I was thinking a lot about the art de Povera people, and you know, money was scarce, and so I would use the canvas over and over and over. So the canvas on the left was a canvas I used many times, and the canvas on the right is a canvas that I got from Army surplus. The Vietnam War was going on at that time. So you can go to the next slide, please. So I was trying to figure out a way to bring that painting that I was doing together with this clay stuff that I was really thinking about time. So I started collecting, the kids would get coffee in the morning and throw their coffee cup in the trash can, 25 cents for a cup of coffee. And even though the empty coffee cups were empty and there was no coffee in them, and being, you know, thinking about money, I thought, God, look at all of those. They're not worth 25 cents, but they're worth something. So I started collecting them and getting these canvases from the Army surplus, and the slit that is in the middle was, I was told, for surgery. So these are these.
Did you keep those?
I'm sorry?
Did you keep any of these works of this period?
No, because once the clay dried, the piece was done and I threw it away. So it was a very momentary piece that was documented and then discarded. You can go to the next slide. So these four, yes?
Did you make drawings at the time?
No, I was just making these very quickly, just going from one to another. So it's the wet clay and the coffee cups and canvases and a piece of rug. You can go to the next slide, please. More of that. You can change the slide. Yeah. So you can see, was looking at Eva Hess, and you can see I was looking at Louise Bourgeois, and you can see stuff I was looking at. So then I go to graduate school. Stay on the slide a second. I get accepted to Davis, where those wonderful teachers were in Northern California. And that summer before going to Davis, I went to Los Osos, where my sister had a house, and I got a waitress job outside of where the Morro Rock is. And I stared at that rock a lot. It's this volcanic lump coming out of the sea. And I made hundreds of these teeny tiny drawings. And I decided that when I got to graduate school, I was going to make the drawings. You can go to the next slide, please.
How big, you see that you see your finger on the one?
Tiny, teeny tiny.
They're tiny, right? And did you make them with graphite, like the monumental drawings you're doing now?
Yes.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And when did you start these drawings? Can you remember? Was that mid-70s?
That day.
That day. It's amazing. So great to see those. Yeah.
So,
next.
Right. next slide. So I got to graduate school and I started making, I'd never seen Adobe before, so I kept thinking about the clay, so I started mixing clay with cement. Go back a second. And my idea was I could put these things on wheels and roll them around, but the wheels were 500 pounds each, and these things weighed like a ton, and the wheels crushed, and we had to tear down the studio walls and forklift the sculptures out. There were about 6 or 7 pieces in the series. And I also threw out my back in the process. So you can go to the next slide. So I started going back into those little teeny tiny drawings, but bringing them up some, because I knew I needed to figure out a new way to approach this enigmatic lump. And what I started realizing in the drawings was that I could get something far denser and far deeper and far more volume-esque just on that piece of paper with pencils than I was able to with those lumps. So something really clicked with me at that time with these drawings. You can go to the next slide, please.
Great, Nancy. It's great to see the drawings behind you in the studio, because while we listen to you talk about your work, we see these monumental drawings in the back.
Yeah.
When you talk about these pieces early on, and I said, was this the first one? It seems like the process of making art is really important. You said you made this big lump of like Adobe, and it had to be, so the only witnesses or the only remaining work of this period first was the drawings. Do these pieces still exist? Did you keep them as an artist? Did you keep them as something you felt you had to preserve?
I didn't keep any of them. However, a friend who was an art conservator saved one of them and sent it to me maybe 10 years ago. And I got it in the same box that I gave it to him in. And I unrolled it and redrew it, and it's at the Hammer Museum presently. They have
great. Got a great home. So let's go to the next slide, perhaps.
So these are, I'm trying to figure out what a drawing is. You can flip through these. These are, you know, drawing on the walls of my studio, drawing on the stuff on the floor of my studio, bringing it together. Is that a drawing? Is that a drawing? Putting it on the wall, does that make it a drawing? Is it
I love the fact that we see now how your drawing practice and your sculpture practice at this point merged. You had the coffee cup, perhaps the clay, but here all of a sudden the graphite, the colors, the sculptural forming, you're finding form in merging these two things.
Yep. Could you go back just to the last slide? I agree with you, Klaus, and this is a perfect example of it. This one on the left is a 2x4s and dowels and glue and a drawing. I drew on the 2x4s. And this one on the right is a drawing. I was, you know, as if I was an old master drawing, studying the sculpture I had made, or is it a drawing? So I didn't really know what the thing on the left was, but I knew the thing on the right followed art history in the fact that a person would study something they made and made a drawing of it.
And it's so fascinating that you sometimes have some monochrome bodies of work, and then if we go to the next one, you merge into
yes. Yes, I consciously realized I wanted to bring color into these works that had no color in them whatsoever. So I started approaching it with a little motorized wheel, and it casting red onto this pile, casting yellow, and making a drawing to study it, and then making drawings of it after it was made. This is red after the fan blew it into the pile. On the left and on the right is a drawing of that idea. These are more drawings trying to figure out what is a drawing. This is a sculpture, again, on the right, a drawing of that sculpture, thinking of it in terms of being my own old master, sketching my work. Yes. So I had a graduate school, what?
When you look at a sculpture and a drawing like this, I think it's so revealing to already know here that you had the same thought process and the same conceptual framework for both. And I think if we go to the next slide, I read a very funny quote. You basically said when you did this work, you had Nevelson sit on you, or you were sitting on her. you were at the time, and correct me if I'm wrong about the timing, but you were also collecting like appliances, TV sets, and you could buy a TV set for 10 cents, 25 cents, and you were assembling these kind of objects of desire, but they were discarded. They were somewhere secondhand in thrift stores and garbage. So you put them together and you made this tableau out of them. Could you say a little bit, because I actually think this is such a fascinating work. Can you say a little bit about that?
I was never satisfied with this piece. And initially, I had collected close to 300 televisions. I silhouette the skyline of San Francisco on my roof. And the landlord got wind of it and said, no, you are not doing this. I said, so I built this piece and I painted it fluorescent orange. However, the fluorescent doesn't come out in the photograph of the slide. And I was never, because it was, yes, this was like a fluorescent orange Louise Nevelson, and I knew it needed to be something different. On the base of the sculpture on the right, I don't know if you see it because of our images are there. At that point in time, I had a small house painting company, and I had been collecting house painting cans and shoved them into the concrete pour in the bottom. And that was very interesting to me. So I thought I needed to step away from those televisions because I never could get them to really transcend their original object. And it just seemed, it wasn't the direction I wanted to go in. So if we could go to the next slide.
I like that so many of the characteristics and artistic strategies that you still follow are already in these very early pieces. Let's talk a bit about these drawing, sculptural constructions here that look like walls.
Yeah.
Can you say a bit more about those? I think those.
Yes. At that time, I had just gotten finished with the television sets and wasn't sure where I was going. I was up late one evening and I looked up at my wall and I saw the first earthquake I'd ever seen. I didn't grow up in California. So I saw my big solid cast concrete building, this really tough building, go woo, like an ocean wave was going through. And I thought, whoa, that's remarkable. So I thought, you know, I stuffed that television with concrete. Maybe I need to go revisit the concrete and leave the televisions behind. So I started building these very thin walls. I would put a piece of plywood up, put up some expanded metal, a couple of rebar, and then with my hand, I could trowel up the side of the expanded metal, the cement. And so all of the residue, the moments, the residue of the movement of the gesture are frozen into the concrete. And then as I was doing it, the best part was all these little bits and dribbles of concrete would fall to the bottom and make this absolutely exquisite anchor on the bottom. So then it would set up, I would pop off the plywood wall. On the other side, you would see the ghost of the plywood wall. And the beautiful thing was, is I could push these things and they would waver back and forth like 1.5 feet, and they wouldn't crack, they wouldn't break. There were these beautifully flexible, very thin, elegant concrete things.
You compared once canoes or paddles or whatever you're working, you compared them with brush strokes of a painter, just a typical part of an image. When we look at these pieces, let's go to the next one and let's go a little bit to this one. We have like a whole beautiful representation of, this was your first solo show, right? This was one of the first big shows?
At that time, I was a roving college teacher. And I went to Virginia Commonwealth University to teach a semester. They had space in the sculpture department. And there in Richmond, after the Civil War, you know, things got burnt and they have meticulous brickwork. And in the brickwork, there would be a big blob of melted something. And I would ask people, what is that? It was a residue of the melted bricks from the Civil War that people were I thought, oh, this is something. So I went back to the Goodwill and Salvation Army. This is my first show. This was at 80 Lake Street. And I took what I learned in Richmond and went and applied it to this exhibition. Now, at that point in time, I realized that was the first and last show I was going to have in the Bay Area, in San Francisco. So Bob Arneson said, you know, you need to get a show in New York. So I went to New York, and Ivan Clark, within 10 minutes of meeting him, gave me a show at his gallery. And 2 years away, I was able to build, this is Big Urn. This is when I started using rebar to make these more voluptuous shapes with the sculpture. So you can go to the next slide. That's a detail of Big Urn. And then this is preparing, this is another itinerant teaching job in Florida State University in Tallahassee. And I was prepping myself to build this piece in New York. And this is the first show in New York. Go forward, please. Oh, one back.
Wrong direction, here.
You can go to the next slide. And so you can see it's very tall, and it's not completely flat. It has this kind of lovely curve. So with that,
how stable was this, Nancy? How stable was this? Because when I didn't want to go too far into this, but you have the assemblage of material you put together, the coffee cups, the clay that is still wet and then falling apart. So there are some works, the concrete walls, where the touch of your hand is important. And then like in the drawings, but then most of the works we saw until now were about a balance or an equilibrium or about falling apart also. This is a piece that looks more
incredibly balanced.
Yeah.
Incredibly balanced. Now, I don't want anybody climbing on it. This was not a piece to be touched. This was a piece to touch with your eyes, not with your, it was not a jungle gym. This is not a sculpture that you would want to put in the center of a city. That is not this sculpture. However, the next sculpture, I was figuring out, but you wanted to talk about the fragility of the pieces. So what I was doing at that point was building them, getting them to exist, and then I would knock them down and throw them away. Okay.
So this was one of your first public commissions.
Yeah.
And as you can imagine, it was quite controversial. I read it was called one of the ugliest public sculptures by people who weren't exactly your fans then, you're ahead of time. Do you want to say a bit about how that made you feel doing something that was so creating people having an opinion?
Well, I got 10 years worth of hate press from it. And the mayor, part of the mayor who made the swing vote to allow this thing to be built in their city, the guy running against him made it part of the platform for the next election that he lost. It was really interesting to me. I was surprised, you know.
A piece like the Richard Serra in Lower Manhattan that created a public outcry. People had to go around it. This created a public outcry. And I think it was taken down after the temporary permission was expired, right?
That was the next piece. That was Worlds Apart. This one stayed there 10 years until the collector wanted to put more work in his shopping center. And he finally said, okay, I'll take that thing down if you need me to take it down to put more work in. Yeah, so for me, it was an odd thing because I think these things are wonderful, obviously, but I knew that I really touched something very serious in people to make them respond so intensely to this stuff. I mean, it's just a sculpture, for goodness sake. That's the Watergate, and that's a freeway that was completely misdesigned.
We go one back, please. Yeah, great.
What's that? That's a freeway that was completely misdesigned that went into a sidewalk, a Foggy Bottom, a really lovely neighborhood. So that people find art, this place to kind of vent their emotions is interesting, kind of, really. It's very odd, but it's interesting.
Oh, it's definitely an opinion. It's definitely a piece that immediately asks people for an opinion. Let's go for the next one, because I think this is so important.
This is trailers. This is another kind of growth. And this is the preview of the piece that we built at MOCA. And I worked with students, and they said, what do you want? And I said, I'd like some trailers, and I'd like some medium-sized to large appliances. And they brought me all this stuff, and I see these hot water heaters there, and I think, oh, those are heavy, they look awful, I don't want to use those. But we use them anyway. And once we got them up there, I realized, wow, those things are great. What was I snubbing those hot water heaters for? Those are really great. So
you were at a point in your career where I think then you participated in Helter Skelter, you were in the Whitney Biennial, you had your solo show at MoMA, all from 92 to 95, a very, very prominent moment in your career. And I think it's always also so revealing to see these controversial pieces creating a critical feedback and audience, but also a fan base around. And then you're fine. Yeah, I would say that's kind of an equivalent in a way. And then you have this incredibly important moment where you articulate something that nobody else, to my mind, as a curator, has not articulated before. And in order to show that a bit more, to elaborate more, not in words, but in your work, we put the video when you installed Helter Skelter at the Geffen Inn. So perhaps we go to this and watch this the first 2 or 3 minutes. So this is the sculpture. We go to the video and we watch the first 2 or 3 minutes. And then at some point, we go back to the conversation. We're so happy to have you here, Nancy, with us. And we can send the video to everybody. Great, let's watch it. Let's watch it a couple of minutes. Talking about monumental sculpture. For me as a curator, I often, when I go to see a sculptural exhibition, I'm always interested in the weight of a sculpture. I'm always asking what does it weigh? And talking about when I described first the delicacy and nearly the force and the violence of the weight of the sculptures, was that something when you started working and in this work, was that something you were a bit shy about your own courage, or was this just Nancy saying like, I want like these big trailers lifted through the space? How did you approach that from a purely constructive point of view?
It came pretty easily to me, Klaus. It's just kind of how I was thinking. And because one thing has led to another, it wasn't like a huge leap. I was moving from one point. I'd done a piece with trailers prior to that in San Francisco that I wasn't happy with. We cut the trailers up, took them apart, and they became flat units. I wanted a chunk of a trailer. So it was very satisfying finding these new ways of building things. And that's the piece that lives at MOCA. Now this piece I approach in a very different way. I had the chance to build a piece for the Gagosian Gallery in Beverly Hills. And I decided that I was going to build this piece so I could take it apart and put it back together and keep the same piece. And I wanted to build the piece so it yielded to the interior space of that beautiful interior room, the Richard Myers space at the Gagosian Gallery. So, for instance,
about your naming, the MoMA piece, even in Fort Belvedere in Florence, still had the name MoMA with it. So here, MoCA, it has the name Gagosian with it. What is the thinking behind that tracing?
It is a memory of the, it's the space that existed at the Gagosian Gallery at that time, and it's a space that this sculpture traveled through in that gallery. For instance, the edge of this slide, a wing is cut off, and actually in the Gagosian Gallery, there was a wall there, so that when you walk down the corridor, the wing came out of that side of the wall, and then you turned and saw the piece from that approach. So again, we moved the piece to the Geffen, and
where
I decided to get
where it looks so glorious and so strong, because you see here, you see the Barbara Kruger, you see the Eileen Getty Plaza, and I'm so grateful and happy that we did this. This is fantastic.
Well, it actually, the new site changes the piece. There's a weird intimacy that is brought back to the piece that was there initially, but maybe got lost a little bit on the Grand Street Plaza. And also it holds its own, like, beautifully from afar, from corners of the block. You see this weird glistening thing and you don't know what it is, and it kind of draws you to it, and then you can kind of walk around.
You and Barbara being neighbors. I love you and Barbara being neighbors.
I'm honored.
And it's such a strong, strong piece. A huge thank you. Really love it there. So we go to the next slide. Whenever there is a slide, there is an added benefit now, Nancy. My heart is like, thank you.
Yeah. Me too. So this is the first piece I did with these accumulation of these small boats. And this is Pleasure Point. This is the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, and its original building in La Jolla. It's a beautiful building, and I'm very happy with this piece living there. And we can go to the next slide. That's the detail of Pleasure Point. And this is Big Pleasure Point. This is in Lincoln Center. And this title came from, there was a mass of boats, this blue boat that's on top. I bought them from a guy who had rented boats at a livery place, and on them he had painted Pleasure Point. So that's it.
How does this feel? It's kind of perhaps a naive question, but I still want to ask it. How does it feel for a sculptor to all of a sudden have on such a prominent city location, such a prominent, strong piece? That must be...
Feels great.
It's one of my favorite pieces. It's really fantastic, Nancy. So we go perhaps to the next.
I love this piece. So after I did the piece at Lincoln Center, I built a huge piece that was like a 95-foot cantilever over a series of roads, freeways, and entrances into this conglomerate, and it was 75 feet tall, and it was very, very colorful. It was a beautiful piece. And there were these boats in it that I had gotten from the Russian River that were not colorful, and there were these aluminum boats that had been used and reused, and you could see every rock and every thing that hit those boats and every welding and every patch that those boats lived through for a long period of time. And I love them. This is monochrome for Paris. The previous piece was at Crystal Bridges. And
so you had to argue to not use French boats, but you got them from...
No, these are my boats. These are not French boats.
It's a beautiful sculpture. Amazing.
Yeah, I'm really happy with it. And the next slide, I love this image. I really realized that there was something going on the surface of these boats that made me think a lot about what I'm doing on the drawing, the layering of these marks and the constant changing of these surfaces in different lights. And I love these pieces. We can go to the next piece. This is our friend Fluid Metal. So there's a fellow that purveys these metal stuff for me. And he just has a sense for metal things and is a great collector of it. And quite a few years ago, he started bringing these children's playground toys to me. And I thought they were very strange, and I didn't know what to do with them, but I bought them from him, and he kept bringing me more and more. And finally, I decided I would start working with them. And I was really worried about them. They were so figurative. I've gone out of my way forever to avoid figurative elements, even though I do believe everything we make is figurative. But these things are figures, and I wasn't sure how to handle them. And then I realized, you know, if I start really putting them together in mass and making these undulating attenuations coming from them, I can start approaching them in kind of a painterly way in a way. And I started thinking about those early Philip Gustins, the abstract ones, the abstract expressionist Philip Gustin. I started thinking about de Kooning. I really am happy with these pieces. So one thing that occurred to me that I want to tell you about in terms of these pieces is as I'm looking at them, I'm trying to figure them out. And it suddenly dawns on me one day, Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman is a fellow that I bought my airplane parts from for many years. And he would show me pictures of himself in the National Geographic with a mobile smelter that he had designed right after World War II. And he went throughout the Southwest, melting down the fleet after the war. And one day I'm looking at these things and I realized, those are Mr. Huffman's airplanes. We started making these things in the late 40s, early 50s, right at the baby boom. People were coming back from the war, melted down the planes and made these things. And when I got them, they were right at the cusp of being, you know, they were being pulled out of the schoolyards and playgrounds, and they were ready to be melted down again. But what that made me start thinking about was, man, this aluminum has been around before Mr. Huffman's airplanes, and it was something before that. It was in the earth before that, and before the earth was here, it was part of some star cluster, and then some supernova happened, and then there were dust particles and clumps of stuff flying around. So I realized this stuff's been around a long time, and it's been many, 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 many different things, and this just happens to be something we did to it, with it, at this one moment, this very particular moment in time. So anyway.
When one visits your studio, and I think we talked about you buying TVs in thrift stores and coffee cups and putting them in wet clay and all of this. I think the sheer idea of accumulating and looking at collections of materials. I remember the last time I was at your studio, you showed me around and we saw groups of different pieces you collected in a way. And
yes.
When I look at the drawings, the German word for pencil is actually something that makes lead. So a Bleistift is something that creates metal. So the drawings, they become metal by drawing on the paper.
Yes.
I think what you were just saying about the kayaks, the canoes, they have traces on them like the drawings. And the idea of reforming, melting, and transforming whatever you find. This is so beautiful when we come to this here, to this body of work that is more monochrome. Of course, it's not completely, but say a bit about this, because I think I saw a couple of these pieces at your studio.
We had hanging around our property all these big cast iron turtles that were 870 pounds and 6 feet across, and cast iron wolves and bronze more turtles and bronze hippos and stuff like that. And at a certain point I thought, you know, I can use this stuff. So the first piece from this series, and this is the Diversifolia series, was dense bud. It was very dense. And the metal was really heavy. And, you know, airplane parts and boats are pretty light. They have a lot of volume, they're light. So the guy who collects metal, purveys metal stuff for me, saw me doing this, and he came by one day and he said, "You want some hogs?" And I said, "You got hogs? Yeah, bring them by." So he brings me the hogs, And then he sees me using the hogs, and then the next day he brings to me what I call a Sears and Roebuck's catalog full of these aluminum creatures, these animals. And so I just started ordering them in mass. And I realized that the way for me to work with it was to think of it almost like marbleizing something. You can go to the next slide. This is a gorgeous, I love this piece. This is Agrifolia majoris. And my engineer did a beautiful job working with me on this thing. This is quite big. And these things, you can go to the next slide. These creatures are pretty much life-size. But what I love about these things is that you can see the bottom of the stand on that bird thing coming out. You see the holes that were used for the welding, and you see the seams of the welding. And when he first brought me the hogs, they were only tack welded with Bondo. And I said to him, you know, if you could go to your guy who makes these things, because you make them to order, if he could make a contiguous weld, then that would be perfect for me, because a tube structurally is a very, very strong form. And that way I could start using the elements themselves as structural forms like I was able to with the boats and the airplanes.
I like the image very much, because in the beginning, when we looked at the walls, we looked at the drawings, we looked at the sculpture and the drawing version, it was always the question, is that a sculpture, is this a drawing? And the way how to perceive a sculpture for me is moving around it. And so here we have this viewer moving around, and we have the drawing definitely being a sculpture on the wall. And we have this very, again, the force, the weight, the delicacy of the sculpture standing there by itself. I would go to the next slide.
Yes.
Say a bit about this, because I think they're such important works. And for me, for example, it's always interesting to ask, how much time do you, how much time does it take to finalize, to complete a work like this?
It takes a long time to draw, but I have a lot of energy, so maybe less for me than somebody who's not got my energy. But it takes a long time, and I love making them, and it's kind of a wonderful thing to make these drawings. I draw on the floor. But then to put them on the wall and to figure out the configuration goes very, very fast, like literally in a matter of moments. And then I'll look at it and maybe noodle with it a little bit, but it goes very fast, that part.
There was one question I didn't want to elaborate too long. When we looked at the coffee cups, wet clay, and then we had these beautiful concrete walls that you brought. Yeah. And for me, it's always a question, how important is the imprint of your hand? Your hand.
Super important. It's layers and layers and layers of the hand. And what happens with the drawing, for me at least, you never can see it all at once. It's just a piece of paper and pencil. However, you never can see it all at once because of all the layers. You need to keep walking, and as the light keeps changing, the angles and the depth of the layers keeps changing. So they're pieces that I can continuously look at over time, and they always seem to appear somewhat different to me.
You have assistants apply the graphite to the drawing?
No,
or is that something you do yourself?
It's the one thing that I don't need anybody to help me unless it's up really high and we pin it on the wall together. Mm-hmm. You know?
They're fascinating works. They're absolutely fascinating works.
And so that's basically what I'm doing during this time now.
Mm-hmm. Because they're both architectural and they have a human scale, but they're also monumental. They're also fragile. Exactly that violence and force of the material and weight with the delicacy of the balance. It's such, coming back to the very early pieces. So we have 6 more slides to look at.
I'll be fast.
Slides, and then.
So this is the newer body of work, and I've been trying to figure out how to go about developing this work and not always have to be humongous. I'm very comfortable in the very large scale. So I went back to my old friend, the table, and I started cutting up. You can go to the next slide, this is a detail. I started taking these, you know, mythical creatures that have been cast in these cartoony-like forms. And I thought, I can start cutting them up. And just go back to that other slide a second. And I can get a complexity of form. And I love seeing the inside of them. And I started thinking about when I was a kid, going to the Statue of Liberty and seeing the outside of the great Statue of Liberty and then going to the inside of it. All of a sudden, whoa, she's really different in the inside. There's big seams and there's tar and there's tubes and there's a spiral staircase. And you saw a whole different process reality. You saw the real reality of the thousands of people who made that thing and their experience and their imprint rather than the idealized Statue of Liberty on the outside.
What are the pieces, Nancy?
Yeah.
Are the pieces, because what we have seen so far in your drawings, you create shapes and you create the material even. And in your sculpture, you very often use found objects. You very often, what are these? Are these found objects or are they made objects?
They're the stuff that I got, the same animals that I was using in the other sculptures. We just cut them up. So they're found objects. The aluminum objects were made recently by this guy who has a Sears and Roebuck's catalog, and I ordered them from. And the bronze and the brass ones were made God knows when. And I bought them from this fella, and we just, so there's like tigers and giraffes and, you know, stuff like that, horses. And we just started cutting it up.
That's amazing. It's a picture of your beautiful sculpture platform at your studio. What are you working on right now? We have this series here. Do you have something on your mind that you are drafting at the moment, that you are conceiving at the moment?
Well, right now I'm making I have ideas for new work and material ready to go for when the coronavirus we're allowed to work closer together. And I'm ready to go with these things. There were, this body of work is scheduled for a show that we postponed with Gagosian. And there's some of the fluid metal works have been postponed for an exhibition that I've been working with Ann Goldstein with for the Art Institute in Chicago. And there's a show that's also been postponed with Ronald Hoffman in Chicago.
I'm so much looking forward to the show that you are organizing with Ann Goldstein. I'm so much looking forward to your Gagosian show here. This is kind of, it's kind of a recurrent question in these studio visits, because of course, so much has been put on pause and so much has been put on, has been delayed. So it's really wonderful to know, to look forward to these 3 shows you're mentioning. So thank you for an incredible visit, Nancy. It's really, really special.
Thank you so much, Klaus. And thank you everybody for coming and joining us in.